Most people learning sword fighting are stuck because they know what to focus on. So instead of just guessing, I asked my private community to send me their questions. And today I'll be answering them. These aren't just random questions. These are from the people who actually started to do this craft by themselves, to actually practice the actual real skill, right? Already struggling and already improving their skill. And if you're serious about getting better, you'll probably recognize yourself at least in one of them. Also, as you can already hear, my voice is kinda cracked a bit, so you just have to get used to it, at least for this video. So let's start with the first question from Abel. Loved your latest videos on parries. Appreciate it, man. How do you deal with below the arch attacks to your lower extremities? I do have more questions, but we'll limit to this one for now. So that's why I recommend you to actually watch the full video to know the full context. So the thing about the attacks that come from below, so any kind of upward cut with the false edge like this, which is kind of unique for the longsword specifically, and also any kind of attack to the leg of our opponent. So here, right, to the hip. These attacks would not be consistently parried downwards with your blade like this. The best defense overall is distance, and it's even more important here than just for parrying techniques, because as I said, you cannot really parry downwards with your blade. You have to void the attack to your leg or to your hands from below. So if my opponent attacks me with an upward cut to my hands from below, then on my side I have to void the attack, and also to keep me even more safe, take a step backward, because this way I'll be not punished for just sticking my hands out like this to my opponent. Of course I can punish him with a double, but that's not a good fancy. So TLDR is defend strikes to your legs and from below the arch with distance. The next question from Abel is, in way of footwork, is there any more information that I am not aware of? When I did Chinese martial arts, there was much more in comparison. Well, the thing about footwork in HEMA, it's kind of obvious that most of the clubs, at least, don't really train their footwork to its fullest potential, compared, of course, to Olympic fencing, or like modern fencing, you can call it like that, where they actually put so much effort into the way that they move rather than the blade work itself. Of course, they need to be precise with their blade work, but it doesn't mean that their footwork shouldn't be always precise as well. So for HEMA, I really advise to actually learning the modern fencing footwork, because it's just the most applicable to our sword fighting practice right here, even with longsword. Yes, and I'll be honest, I don't know anything about Chinese martial arts, so I'm probably on the ignorant side, but like I said, there isn't much things to learn for footwork in HEMA, but the fundamentals you can learn from the modern fencing and apply to the HEMA practice. The third question is from the Martin, who's an old-timer inside of my community, an OG member, you can call it like that. So, given the target audience of your channel, I would like to hear your opinion about shortcuts in fencing some people are taking in order to get tournament result fast. So then I asked him what he meant by shortcuts. And there are people who specialize on things that work in tournaments only. So no historical background, no basics, no techniques, nothing except what brings the results. Typically, you can see these people loving one-handed thrust or cuts, gazelings, or hand undercuts, for example. But I saw other techniques being abused for this solo purpose. I hope this explanation makes sense. So my honest opinion about the so-called shortcuts in fencing to just score in a tournament, well, my idea is that a perfect swordsman would adapt to any kind of rule set, to any kind of tournament. Of course, to win, right? Because that's the whole point of a tournament. And I know some of the techniques, like hand snipes with an undercut, or just one-handed thrusts like this, or to the knee, are quite good because they work, right? Because they're subtle movements that just score. In my opinion, the best swordsman would adapt to any rule set, but it doesn't mean that he's bad. So shortcuts, well, shortcuts, if they work in a tournament, then you have to give credit to that person to actually winning the tournament, because at least in my opinion, in swordfighting, there is no such things as cheap tricks. I mean, of course, We do not kick our opponent in the balls or bash his head with the pommel, right? Like historically we can do this, right? But in tournaments it doesn't, like it's very hard to do basically, right? But what is the historical context? Like the historical context is the same context that we would have today, fighting with sharp swords, with sharp objects like swords, right? If anything works, like one-handed thrusts, then it works, right? It's not all about striking your opponent with the perfect, masterful technique, right? Like in historical context, it's all about wounding him to a point where he could not fight back anymore. It's not about killing him outright with one swing, with one perfect technique. It's about wounding him so much that he doesn't want to fight back anymore because the blood, because of the everything else, right? The stress and yeah, everything that comes with it. So I don't see these cheap techniques in tournaments as shortcuts. If something's stupid, but it works, then it's not stupid. That's the line that I commonly use. By the way, every question in this video comes from my free community. So if you ever want direct feedback from me or you're stuck in something specific, that's where I answer everything. The link's in the description. So moving on with the Martin's question is, what are your fencing goals? Not related to the community or channel, but your own and specifically fencing goals. What do you aim for or wish to achieve? So my private fencing goals is getting to the top 100 in HEMA ratings, specifically in longsword. And I always see myself as an underdog. You may be surprised because of my YouTube channel, right? And the views that I get and the subscriptions, right? But these are just vanity metrics, right? Well, my goal is actually to get to the at least top 100. But if I make it even further, maybe to top 30, top 20, top 10 even, in 10 years time, then I'll be glad to take the specific steps to actually get there. Yes, it's pretty straightforward. And I want to get to the position where I could be recognized as a very hard or a very good contender in all of the tournaments worldwide. That's a huge goal, right? But I need to have some kind of North Star goal to reach for. At least take the appropriate steps. So Evo asks me, when did I start practicing sword fighting? So the actual practice, not just watching movies about it or videos, was actually in September 2023 when I started to go for the first time to my HEMA club, and I learned all of the skills from top performers in HEMA from there. So Robin asks, I'm so new, I don't feel I know what I should be asking, but longsword is fundamentally different from every other martial art I have studied. As I practice, I get glimpses as to why, but maybe explaining some of the reasons for those different fundamentals. To properly answer this question, I would need to specifically know what fundamentals you're asking for. So what is the reason behind the fundamentals in longsword, such as swinging the sword first and then training footwork, like in this specific sequence, or why we keep the fencing stance when we move, or where we just in place fighting, right? I don't really know on what exactly you're asking for, but I'll try to at least answer what I think you're asking for. So let's start with the fencing stance. Why we use the fencing stance? Because from this position, we're already prepared, like a spring, to move forwards or backwards, of course, being in a sword fighting scenario. Why we use shuffle steps instead of just walking towards our opponent or running into him? Well, we actually have these footwork patterns in fencing called plaissier, right? So so-called rush-in move, but it's more precise than just running towards your opponent and swinging. Because in sword fighting, most of all, it's all about the control of your movement rather than just swing a sword mindlessly. A good longsword fencer doesn't use any extra movement when he doesn't need it. He just uses the most optimal movements, very subtle movements also, right? It's not about swinging hugely your sword and then delivering the attack. For example, you can deliver the attack from this position with a subtle movement or a thrust and still being in control of your movement and your own defense, so your own safety. So control means safety. Control also means that you're able to react to any kind of situation in actual sword fight scenario, so where all the chaos could be unleashed. Michael asks for sword fighting beginner gear. So the two most important items for beginners to get is a padded longsword and a down-to-earth fencing mask which fits on your face. The padded longsword is specifically 125 centimeters of total length, and I would advise you getting the flat bladed version, but if you could not get a hold of the flat blade, then just order a round bladed one and get it as quickly as possible to actually start learning and training and having access to the low gear sparring environment, even with your friends, with your colleagues, maybe even with your family member if he's interested in learning sword fighting with you. And also getting a hold of a just down to earth, the most basic fencing mask. And that means that you can take a lot of hits to the face when your opponent or you are trying to hit the other with the actual intention to hit, rather than just swing the sword in front of him. We are training with the intention to hit our opponent's body than his sword. This is the magic of fencing. So do not buy the steel longsword first things first. This is the most common beginner mistake that I see beginners make. They actually order a steel longsword, even a replica in some sorts, and think that they can train with it basics. No. I'd say that I learned 60% or even up to 80% of my initial skill with just these two simple items. Of course, training with structure and actually sparring against other opponents. This is what you actually need, not any other bullshit. Of course, you could also probably get some kind of protection to your hands, like simple war gloves and some sort of crotch protection, and nothing more. You don't need more things. You just need these two important things, these two important items to actually start learning safely, with control, with the intention, and with consistency, right? And the other thing that I need to point out is, do not buy a steel feather shirt before you don't buy the whole HEMA equipment for your steel practice. Just buying a longsword wouldn't make you a swordsman. You need to train with consistency and with what you've got. Why the fencing mask and the padded longsword? You don't need to spend a fortune on a HEMA gear and a feather shirt to even start beginning learning the fundamentals. And the last question, which is from Eric: I will take any and all advice for how to train without a club. I looked up my location on the club sites you recommended, and the nearest one to me is 250 miles. Well, then create a micro group in your vicinity with people who have an interest in sword in actually learning the practical skill. But of course, you need to learn the basics yourself in order to do that, right? But the important thing that I need to point out is, don't come up with any prerequisites that you need to complete before you actually start to create some kind of micro group. No, all you need to do is to just get a simple gear and just start sparring. Of course, safely, without thrusts with your padded longswords, because these swords don't bend on impact. Of course, in a thrust you can take hits from cuts, but not from thrusts. And of course, also having a fencing mask on top of your head, that should help. So if you made it this far, you probably care about actually getting better in sword fighting, not just watching YouTube content about it, not just thinking about starting, but actually doing it yourself, actually improving with a blade. That's exactly why I built my free community. It's where I answer all of the questions like these. I also break things down in important detail which actually matters for a beginner. So I don't want to just info dump you and overwhelm you with unnecessary information. And I actually help people train properly. So if you want access to that, the link is in the description. Or you can keep watching my videos. But at some point, you have to start asking questions. And remember, always take the initiative.